Hi everyone, I am Rachel and welcome to session 1 of my croissant class. For anyone who is joining me when this airs, which is Wednesday, May 13th at 10 a.m., I will be hopping on Instagram Live in an hour at about 11 to answer questions. Welcome to my apartment where I'm going to be filming the online croissant workshop. Thank you so much for watching. I'm really excited about this class and really excited that so many of you have expressed interest. So before I get started, I would highly recommend going through the recipe packet and reading through the whole thing. That'll be your homework for after this, because it'll give you kind of a roadmap for where we're going. Laminated doughs aren't particularly tricky at any specific step, but the process itself can be kind of intimidating. So laminated dough might not be a term that you're familiar with, but what a laminated dough is, it's basically any kind of dough where you have two separate components. You've got a détrempe, which is the dough component of your dough, and you have a barrage, which is the butter component of your dough. And you're putting those together and rolling and folding them several times to create these layers, these alternating layers of dough and butter. I want to go over sort of the schedule of how these sessions are going to be put together and then how you can follow along or not follow along when you're making your croissant dough. So today is session 1. We're going to be mixing the détrempe, which, like I said, is that dough portion of your dough, and that needs to rest before we can work with it. So you can either make that a day ahead of time or the night before. We'll talk about some options when I go ahead and mix it. But that's all we're going to be covering today, just an overview of the process and then mixing that first component. Tomorrow in session 2, we're going to prepare our barrage, which is the butter portion of the dough, and then we're going to lock that into our détrempe, which is exactly what it sounds like. We're going to envelop the butter with the dough that we've made, and then we're going to do our 3 turns. So tomorrow's session is really the only session where it's important that you follow a particular schedule and that you be available for about 2.5 hours from when you start your lock-in process to when you finish your 3rd turn. Everything else in the croissant dough process can be adjusted, so things can be paused, frozen, etc., except for that period of time in between the lock-in and that 3rd turn. The day after that, we're going to take our completed dough that has 3 turns and we're going to sheet it out, which means to just basically roll it out into a rectangular piece that can get cut into our croissants. So day 3 we'll do the sheet out, and then I'll show you how to cut and shape all of your pastries. And then on day 4 we'll go through proofing and baking. So that's sort of the overview. As I mentioned before, these are all going to be posted onto IGTV and YouTube. My apologies to YouTube viewers. This is going to be shot vertically, so you're going to have some black lines on the side of the page. But these are going to be posted and then they'll stay up for at least a month, so you'll be able to view these at any time. The only reason that you might want to follow along with our schedule is that after each session, I'll be getting on IG Live so that we can answer questions, so that I can answer your questions. The schedule changes a little bit each day, so take a look at our webpage, coilsbakeshop.com, click on the online croissant class link, and you'll have a full schedule there of all of the times when the sessions will be posted, and then also the IG live sessions as well. So croissant dough is a laminated dough. You may not be familiar with that term, but I'm sure you're familiar with the doughs, with products made with laminated dough. Laminated dough is any kind of dough where you have 2 components, a dough component and a butter component, that are put together and layered through sequential turns or rolling and folding the dough. So some examples of laminated doughs are puff pastry, croissant dough, which of course we're going to make over the next couple days, or Danish dough is another similar to croissant laminated dough. This sort of concept can seem a little confusing in the beginning, but I think it's helpful to think about pie dough as a sort of helpful comparison. So you've probably made pie dough, and you're probably already familiar with the concept of a dough that has pieces of butter suspended in the dough. This arrangement creates flakes, so you're already dealing with some kind of lamination there. When you go to roll out your pie dough, you spread that butter out into layers. When the butter melts, it creates steam and you push those sort of flakes apart. All you're doing when you're making a laminated dough is you're creating a much less haphazard arrangement for that butter and dough. You're creating organized layers so that you get sheets of pastry and sheets of butter. One thing that's interesting about croissant dough is that it's a hybrid of 2 types of leavening. So if we back up a little bit, in baking we have 3 kinds of leavening. We have chemical leavening, which is baking powder, baking soda, something that you would add to a batter to make it rise. We have mechanical leavening, which is anytime you're incorporating air or steam in order to push something physically apart. The last form of leavening is of course organic leavening, so that refers to using yeast and fermentation. So croissants are interesting in that they use both organic and mechanical leavening, and it's part of what makes them such a delightful pastry, because you end up with a pastry, which you'll see, a small pastry about yay big actually gets 3 or 4 times bigger once it's fully proved and then hits the oven and gets this sort of oven spring from its mechanical leavening. So it's one of the things that makes croissants the most special, but it's also the thing that makes them a little trickier to work with. Croissant dough is definitely harder to work with than puff pastry, because while you're doing the lamination, there's yeast in the dough and that fermentation is starting and it's acting on the dough. So you have to do some things to counteract that fermentation process to keep your dough cold and stable as you're working with it. But we'll talk through all of that. So we're gonna get started with our very first step in the croissant making process, and that is making the détrempe. And the détrempe, again, is that dough portion of the dough. The détrempe needs to be made ahead of time so that it can rest and so that the gluten can relax, so that we'll actually be able to roll out our dough and do those turns. You can make the croissant dough or the détrempe the night before and put it in the fridge. Recently, this is not in your packet, but recently I've started actually freezing the détrempe before I pull it out of the freezer into the fridge. What happens when you freeze that dough is it really chills it down quickly. It gets that yeast to stop working, and they kind of give you less, the yeast gives you less trouble during the lamination process if you get it really, really slowed down. We're gonna go ahead and mix this détrempe, like I said. If anyone got a kit from us, you're gonna use everything that's in the bag, the labeled bag, plus your small quantity of butter. But what we have in here is all-purpose flour, salt, sugar, yeast, and 60 grams of butter. So I'm just gonna start, I have clean hands, I'm just gonna start by incorporating these ingredients. And it doesn't matter too much if that butter is such a small quantity, that it doesn't matter too much if it's room temperature or not. All I'm gonna do is just break it up. I just wanna distribute it through the dough. And we just have a small quantity of butter in the détrempe. It just makes it easier to work with, softens the dough a little bit. A lot of people ask me questions about adding sourdough starter to their dough, and that's definitely something that you can do down the road. It's not something that we do at the bakery, and that is in large part because this is a 3-day process. So fermenting something slowly over 3 days does quite a bit to develop flavor, and with the addition of salt, sugar, and a lot of butter, I have never found that you notice flavor differences dramatically by adding a naturally leavened product. So I've never found that it's something that I wanted to sort of pursue. So I just like to use straight active dry yeast for this. Okay, so as you can probably see, we've got all of our butter distributed just in little pieces throughout. And then we're gonna go ahead and add our milk. We're using whole milk, and we wanna definitely use whole milk so that we're adding sort of the correct amount of fat to the dough. If you're not a whole milk household, but you have non-fat and cream, which often people carry half and half and non-fat, you can mix a little bit of those. Unfortunately, I've never worked with milk alternatives in croissants, just because they really rely on the butter, so it hasn't seemed like a priority, but you're welcome to try. I just can't speak for their efficacy here. Okay. So we're gonna add 2 cups of milk, and then I've just got a little bit of extra cold water. This milk is cold from the fridge as well. And we're gonna bring this dough together. I often get asked why I don't use just a little more milk if we need it, and I don't have a good answer to that. It's just one of those idiosyncrasies that I've come up with over time. And I think sometimes if people are buying just like a pint of milk for this recipe, I don't want them to feel like they have to go buy another one just for a couple more tablespoons of liquid. Okay, so I'm just bringing this dough together, and you know, I brought this spoon out, but to be totally honest, I almost never use it. I know I said you needed it, so I apologize, because I don't think I'm gonna use it at all. All I'm doing is just distributing this milk, and as you probably saw, I like to pour it kind of around the edges so that I've already done a lot of the work of evenly distributing that liquid. And then I don't end up with any sort of portions of the dough that are particularly waterlogged. Now looking at my hands right now, you're probably thinking I should have used a spoon, and you might be right about that, but we've already headed down this road. Okay, so at this stage, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take out this portion of the dough, this main portion of the dough that's properly hydrated, and I'm gonna pop it on the bench, which I've lightly floured. And then what I'm gonna do is just add a little bit more liquid to this part of the dough that needs it. If you can see here, I just have some scraps down here, and those just need a little more liquid. It looks like I'm not gonna need any of the water today. This helps you get a really nice and evenly hydrated dough, even without a mixer. Okay. Now, when you're kneading dough, I think one of the things that gets overlooked as far as doing it neatly is actually stopping and washing your hands. If I try to knead the dough right now with these hands, it's just gonna stick and go everywhere. So I'm gonna actually pause and wash my hands, get them clean and dry, and then I'll be able to handle this a lot more cleanly. Okay. So I have got clean hands now, and I'm ready to knead my dough. We want to bring this dough together so that it's homogeneous and smooth, but it's not going to look completely like a fully developed gluten bread dough. That was very awkwardly said. It's not going to look like a bread dough is what I'm trying to say. Croissants are this sort of hybrid in a lot of different ways, and they definitely inhabit some sort of space between bread and pastry. So we want to bring this together and knead it until it smooths out, but not so much that we've overdeveloped that gluten. Okay. This is a pretty stiff dough. You can't see, but I'm actually up on my tiptoes, which I like to do because I'm not super tall. And often when I'm working with dough like this, I will go ahead and get up on my tiptoes. It's a little easier on your wrists, and it'll give you some more strength. So when I'm kneading this dough, what I'm doing basically is I'm turning 90 degrees, I'm folding the dough on itself, and then I'm applying pressure and pushing it away. Turning, folding, pressing, turning. 90 degrees, I'm folding the dough on itself, and then I'm applying pressure and pushing it away. Turning, folding, pressing, turning. So we're just doing this in a circular motion, going around until the dough starts to have a good amount of resistance. Now, if you're used to doing the window pane test for making bread, if that doesn't mean anything to you, don't worry, it's irrelevant. But if you're used to doing that, we're never gonna get there on this dough. It's not gonna get that developed. We don't need to worry about that though, because when we do our turns, we're going to be developing the gluten as we go. Okay, this is mostly there. I've still got a lot of tearing, which is just going to keep happening, so don't worry about that. But the most important part is that it's got some nice structure to it, and I don't see any wet or dry spots. So visually, nor do I feel any parts of the dough that are wetter or drier. You definitely want to keep kneading if you have sort of one area of the dough that's kind of stiff and another that's really floppy. Make sure you continue to kind of incorporate those. I'm going to give it just a couple more kneads for good measure. One other way to gauge whether or not your dough is ready, it'll start to kind of smooth out like so. It tears a little bit, but basically it is smooth and homogeneous. But the other thing is you can kind of see if that dough has a little spring and resistance to it. So if I press on it, it mostly bounces back, it holds its shape very well, and it's nice and stiff. So that tells us that this is where it needs to be. When you're making croissant dough, you're always kind of thinking towards the next step. So every time you put something away, you want to think about what am I going to be doing with it next time, and how should I put it away so that it'll be easy to work with. The next thing we're going to do with this dough is the lock-in, where we roll this out to a square and fold the butter into it. So what I'm going to do is press this as flat as I can. This way I won't have to roll out a big blob of dough later. It'll also chill more evenly and efficiently in the fridge. So I'm going to go ahead and double wrap this. Now you have a few options with the détrempe. You can pop this in the fridge now overnight. Or if you're following along with the class and doing this sort of mid-morning, what I would recommend as the temperature is getting warmer, I would recommend popping this in the freezer until bedtime and then putting it in the fridge the night before. What that'll do is it'll stop the yeast from working and it'll really slow them down so that when we go to do our lamination tomorrow, the dough will be a lot more forgiving, we'll have less fermentation, fewer air bubbles working in the dough. Okay, we've done it. We have finished step 1 of our croissant dough. If you're watching this again on Wednesday, May 13th, I will be hopping on Instagram Live to answer questions at 11. If you're watching this later, I will attempt to post that Instagram Live session to IGTV so you can find out what we talked about. Thanks again. I'll see you soon. Bye.